Hello and welcome to our webinar. Today we'll be talking about child protection. So our session today will cover a little bit about myself, a little bit about St Adam's College. We'll have a look at the statistics in Australia in regards to child protection, and then we've got 4 learning outcomes: the different types of child abuse, your role in protecting children, the primary role of different agencies, and strategies to protect children and educators. And then we'll have time for questions. So a little bit about me. I am an early childhood teacher. I've worked in the field since 2002. I've worked in a range of early childhood settings, including long day care, preschool, and I've spent about the last 10 years in vocational education and training, delivering training in the Certificate 3 and the Diploma of Early Childhood, and in various different leadership roles. I have a Master of Education, a Bachelor of Early Childhood, a Diploma of Children's Services, and then a range of other education-related qualifications. I also have a little bit of experience in child protective services for different placements throughout my qualifications. So a little bit about St Adam's. St Adam's is a registered training organisation based in Victoria. They specialise in training in early childhood, individual support and ageing support, and offer a number of qualifications to domestic and international students, as well as professional development courses specifically to childcare centres and family daycare schemes. So let's now talk about child protection in Australia. According to a 2017 study, that 1 in 32 children receive child protective services. And 74% of those are repeat clients. Ongoingly, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are 7 times more likely to require child protective services. So very much overrepresented there. Children from remote areas, geographical areas, have the highest rate of substantiating suspected abuse. And in 2016-17, there was $4.3 billion spent on child protective services in Australia. The amount of children who received child protective services was about 168,000. 119,000 of those were investigated, and about 64,000 were put on a care and protective order. So that was after substantiated claim. They were actually placed in a plan in an order to protect that child. And 57,000 of them were in out-of-home care, so in care outside of the family, such as foster care. So now we're going to have a look at a little bit more of the statistics state by state. So I'll leave this on the screen for a moment so you can have a look at your state and how the numbers are. This table indicates the number of children who were subject to an investigation, the number of children who were then put on care and protection orders, and children who are in out-of-home care. So you can see that there's 168,000 in total there, the majority coming from New South Wales, followed by Victoria, and then Queensland. So child protection in Australia, there is another visual there. So there's 60% were investigation only, 8.1 were then removed and put into out-of-home care, and 1.9 of an investigation care and protection order there. So children who are subject to a finalised investigation, these are the substantiated and non-substantiated. So you can see that there's about 50% of cases in Victoria were substantiated, less in the other states. So now we're going to have a look at the different types of child abuse or neglect and their indicators. So types of abuse, there is physical, sexual, emotional, neglect, and family violence. Each state calls these, have slightly different wording around these and around the definition. So I've gone with generic definitions to suit an audience that is from all across Australia. We will go through state-specific terminology a little bit later. So, what is physical abuse? Physical abuse can consist of any non accidental infliction of family violence of a child or any person. Examples of physical abuse may include beating, shaking, burning, assault with implements, and female genital mutilation. When we're talking about abuse, we usually have two types of indicators. An indicator is just a sign, really, of abuse that an early childhood worker, such as yourself, would be looking for. So, your physical signs are things that you're looking for that you can see physically. In this case, it would be any marks on the child, whether they're bruises, welts, breaks, burns, cuts, bruises, and children often do hurt themselves, but this is an ongoing series of injuries that paints a picture of abuse. So it's not a once off, this child's broken their arm, but it is a pattern of regular injuries to a child that aren't explained by usual childhood incidents or accidents or being clumsy as such. Then there's behavioural signs, and in behaviour for all types of abuse, you're really looking for a change in behaviour. So you're looking when a child changes from being bright and bubbly to withdrawn and sullen, and may all of a sudden have unusual behaviour different than what you're used to in your day-to-day interactions with that child. So that's things like aggressive behaviour, disproportionate reactions to events. For physical abuse specifically, things like wearing clothes that are unsuitable for weather conditions. Early on in my early childhood career, I was unfortunate enough to care for a 4-year-old boy, and he wore several jumpers all the time. And I remember one day we had water play, and it was summer. He had 3 jumpers on and long sleeve shirts, and it was summer, and we had water play outside, and he spilt a bucket of water over himself, and I had to take off his shirt, and he was very reluctant to take off his shirt. And finally, when we got his shirt off him, we realised that he had cigarette burns all over his arms, and we, up until that point, didn't ever realise that there was any issues. And then looking back on it, we noticed that there was a number of behavioural signs over a period of time that we may have missed. And for us, the wearing of the long jumpers and shirts in summer, which was a very big indicator and did trigger a child protective report to be filed and investigated. Sexual abuse. So what is sexual abuse? There's sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, which are two different things. Sexual abuse is when a person uses their power or authority over a child to involve them in sexual activity. I'm sure we're all aware of what sexual abuse is. In early childhood, the types of things that we're looking at can include child touching or groping or fondling of child's genitals, and it can also be not touching them as such, but it can be talking to them in sexual ways, sending sexual messages, exposing sexual body parts to a child, and forcing them to watch sexual acts as well. The indicators are less obvious for sexual abuse. There are some physical signs that you might be able to see, such as injuries to the vaginal or the genital area, and discomfort urinating, sexually transmitted diseases, and frequent urinary tract infections are also something to look at. Behavioural indicators can be things such as being over-sexualised and acting out scenarios that they shouldn't know at that age. It could be a conversation between two children and physical role play of that child touching another child in an inappropriate manner. Regressive behaviour as well, such as bedwetting, and again, that change in behaviour of changing from what type of child they used to be. We then have sexual exploitation. So this is a form of sexual abuse where offenders use their power over a child to emotionally or sexually abuse them. It often involves situations and relationships where young people receive things such as those things listed there: food, accommodation, gifts, money, in return for participating in sexual activities. Child exploitation can occur in persons or online, and sometimes the child may not even realise they're a victim. So here we're talking about potentially older children, but as younger and younger children become exposed to the internet and using computers, it is something to keep an eye on as well, and something for parents to be aware of. So who are the perpetrators of sexual abuse? And the reason we're looking at this is just to give you a little bit of information so that you can keep an eye out for any indicators and signs. So usually perpetrators are people that are known to that child. That might be a family member, it could be a coach, a peer or another child, a family friend, and someone who has trust within that child's family. Identifying perpetrators isn't really part of your job, but it's interesting to note that here's some indicators that might show that are worth watching out for if you do attempt that there is some sexual abuse. If it's a family member, there might be attempts by a parent to alienate that child from the other parent. There might be overprotective or volatile relationships between the child and the parents, and there might be reluctance by a child to be alone with that parent. For family members, if there is abuse between family members, it can seem like they're dating, and they can be embarrassed when they're found alone together. And then if it is another adult, then it could be any kind of inappropriate behaviour, such as driving children places, giving gifts, inappropriate contact. And again, that could be older children here that we're talking about as well. But if you do think that another childcare worker that you're working with or an educator in your service is being inappropriate, it's worth just keeping an eye on and noting down any issues or anything that you notice, really. Emotional abuse. Emotional child abuse occurs when a child is repeatedly rejected, isolated, or threatened frightened by threats or by witnessing family violence. It also includes hostility, derogatory name calling, and put downs. In my opinion, emotional abuse is part of every other type of abuse as well, so you can't be sexually abused without it also emotionally abusing you and psychologically harming you. The physical signs are less. They can be things such as speech disorders or language delays and delays in other types of development. The behavioural signs that you're looking for are things like fear of failure, violence, overly compliant, passive, undemanding behaviour, or on the flip side of that, extremely demanding behaviour, a low tolerance for frustration and low self-esteem. Neglect. So neglect includes a failure to provide the child with an adequate standard of nutrition, medical care, clothing, shelter, or supervision to the extent that the health or physical development of the child is significantly impaired or placed at serious risk. In some circumstances, the neglect of a child can place the child's safety in immediate risk. And it might not be immediate, it might be that the compact of these incidents over a period of time is likely to result in long-term harm as well. So for neglect, we're talking about not meeting their needs, and this could be things like not changing their nappy, which could then turn into physical abuse if it then escalates. Can be things like not providing enough food, enough warm clothing, and there can be a number of reasons behind neglect, and we're not really going into the causes of child abuse today, but in my experience, I have had to make a report about neglect previously, and it really was due to mental health issues that the family was going through, and also other stresses, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. So in the case that I had a child who would come to preschool, she was a baby, into childcare only 2 days a week, and she would be wearing the nappy that she left in on the Tuesday when she came back on the Monday, and her nappy hadn't been changed, and she had terrible welts from not being cleaned and washed, and it was something that had to be reported, and we supported the family. It was something that could be educated and supported, so that it wasn't an ongoing threat to the child. Physical signs can be appearing dirty or unwashed, being consistently inappropriately dressed for weather conditions, being at risk of injury or lack of supervision, constantly being hungry, tired, and listless, having inadequate shelter and unsafe or unsanitary conditions. And it is behaviour signs that we're looking for here as well. So it's begging or stealing for food, appearing withdrawn, aggressive behaviour in older children, potential involvement in criminal activity, and poor socialisation habits. The next one is family violence, and in some states this is called domestic violence, and this is behaviour towards a family member that includes physical violence or threats, verbal abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, or financial and social abuse. And this impacts the child because they're in that environment and having to be part of witnessing that occur, which of course has an impact on that child. The physical signs that you're looking for can be things like speech disorders, delays in physical development, failure to thrive, which is where a child doesn't develop and meet milestones. It can be physical indicators as well, that we've spoken about earlier, such as bruises and welts and cuts. Behavioural signs, things like acting out, bedwetting again, and regressive behaviour. And then on that spectrum, the child being overly demanding or not demanding at all, so very attention seeking or very withdrawn, and a change of behaviour for that child. I'll pause now for questions to see if there's any questions on the indicators of abuse. Okay, so there was no question, so I'll just continue. So your role in protecting children. So we are morally, ethically, as well as legally obliged to report suspected child abuse. We have what's called a duty of care, as well as being a mandatory reporter. And then in Victoria, there's also 2 other requirements that I'll discuss. So mandatory reporting is a requirement of all states. It's a federal requirement. And this is for anyone working with children or volunteering with children. And this includes nurses, doctors, as well as teachers and, of course, childcare workers or educators. Mandatory reporters who fail to comply with these reporting obligations may be committing a criminal offence, and I believe it's up to 5 years imprisonment if you don't meet your mandatory reporting requirements. And that's on you personally, not on the childcare centre. So it really is your responsibility as a reporter, as a mandatory reporter, to report any indicators that you believe need to be reported and putting the child at significant risk of harm. In Victoria, there's another requirement which is called failure to disclose, and this is with children, anyone working with children under 16 that has a reasonable belief that that child is being sexually abused specifically. And a reasonable belief is not the same as having proof. Your role in child protection is never to investigate or to get proof. It is just to report any indicators that you believe is putting that child at risk of harm in any way. So sometimes this can be that a child discloses and tells you, and sometimes this can be other professional observations that you've taken over a period of time, which paints a reasonable belief that someone in the same position would have formed the belief as well that this child is being abused. Failure to protect is another requirement in Victoria, where anyone who works with children is required to report under the Children, Youth and Families Act. And again, that's a 5-year imprisonment if we don't meet those requirements. So your role of different agencies in child protection. So we have a number of different agencies across Australia that are involved. We have a ASIQA, who of course are the national regulator for childcare centres. And a ASIQA have a national quality framework that all early childhood services need to meet. And the requirement of the childcare centre themselves as a business is to make sure that they have the right policies and procedures in place to allow reporting. Then we have state rules and state departments, and that's not regulated by a ASIQA, but regulated by the state departments. And then we have the police department who do the investigation and the prosecution as required. So the relevant departments, in ACT, we have the Office of Children, Youth and Family Support, and you can see the legislation there, and the actions that are reportable, and these are the terms that they call them in these states. So in ACT, it is abuse, neglect, threats to kill, residing with a person who's previously killed a child, and sexual or financial exploitation. In New South Wales, we have the Department of Community Services, and they require you to report neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, and psychological harm. In the Northern Territory, we have the Family and Children's Services Department of Health and Community Services, and they require you to report abandonment, neglect, maltreatment, and female genital mutilation. In Queensland, we have the Department of Child Safety, and we are required to report harm, immaterial how the harm is caused, harm caused by physical, psychological, or emotional abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, or exploitation. So you can see the wording in Queensland is slightly different, but has the same requirements. In South Australia, we have the Children, Youth and Family Services, the Department of Family and Community Services, and they require you to report on sexual abuse, physical or emotional abuse, neglect, threats to kill, residing with a person who has previously killed a child, unwilling to maintain or inadequately supervising a child, abandonment and domestic violence. And in Tasmania, there is the Department of Health and Human Services, and they require abuse or neglect, threats to kill, residing with a person who has previously killed a child, and neglect. In Victoria, we have the Child Protection and Juvenile Justice branch of the Department of Human Services, and they require you to report on abandonment, physical injury, sexual abuse, emotional and psychological harm, and neglect. In WA, we have the Department of Community Development, and they require you to report on neglect, ill treatment, and the WA have defined a policy that events from which a child is in need of protection, such as sexual abuse and physical abuse, and significant harm. So to recap that, we have a CEQA, which oversees the childcare centres meeting requirements of other state-based authorities. We then have the State Department, who you would report to and who sets the rules on when you report, how you report, and what is reportable. And then we have the Police Department, who would be included mostly by the state departments as required. Any questions that we have on reporting, and today I wasn't able to go through how you actually do a report because we have so many people on the call from different states. So if you did want to go and wanted to revisit how you would report, then I would have a look at the publications from that specific state department in your state on how to make a report. Usually there is a help number or an online form that you fill out, and that then goes to a central database where those things are logged, called, and investigated as required. So I have a question coming in about what you need to report. So when you're reporting, you need to be reporting the indicators that you've seen, and usually this is done depending on your centre's policy and procedure. You would be recording what you see, and you would be recording it in a non-judgmental way, in a very clear manner. So if you see a cigarette burn on a child's arm, you would write a report stating where you saw it, what you saw, the size of the cigarette burn, how you came to notice it, but very unbiased and unjudgmental. So you wouldn't put in there that you saw a horrible big burn on a child's arm. You would say that during the course of changing a child for nappy change, you noticed a mark that was 3 centimetres long on the inside of their arm or leg, and what it looked like and what you saw. So very factual and objective as much as possible as you can. In a childcare centre, there may be the policy of the centre to report that to the director and to fill out a specific form and lodge that with a specific person. But being aware that the responsibility on you as a mandatory reporter is to make that report. So if that director decides for whatever reason not to make the report, you still are required to make that report. So it's important that whilst you're meeting the requirements of the centre's policies, that you're also responsible to meet the requirements of the law. So that's something to note as well. And it might be worth speaking to your employers about what their process is for reporting, what system do you use, and how does that escalate, and how do they ensure your responsibility as a mandatory reporter. So strategies to protect children and educators in early childhood. So here are some strategies about how you can ensure the children you're working with are kept safe. The first thing is to acknowledge that this is a serious problem and there are probably children in your care that are being abused, 1 in 32 children. So if you think about how many children in your centre, if you've got more than 30 children, then the statistics would say there is somebody there. In my 15 or so years in early childhood, I've made 4 reports, and I guess that's statistically across the children that I've worked with. The next thing is to ensure a child-safe environment. So if you work at a childcare centre, you should have a policy about the child-safe environment, and this should include things like creating relationships with family and children, having a good rapport with children so that they can communicate with you and trust in you and disclose to you. Fostering relationship with families and communities so that parents feel safe to talk to you about issues and hardships they might be facing. It's also important to note that a parent doesn't wake up one morning and decide to abuse their child, that there are usually other factors, whether they be alcohol, drugs, mental health issues, and that usually providing additional supports, what they call secondary supports to a family, will dramatically reduce the risk of that child to things like neglect and physical abuse. Each centre should have a child protection policy in place, and if you haven't seen this, I would suggest that you get a copy of that and have a look at what your centre requires. This should be something that's living and breathing and that all the staff are very aware about and discuss frequently. Know the reporting process for your state and territory. So having a look at that state department's website and figuring out how you would make a report. Who do you call? What do you say? What forms need to be filled out? And what supplementary evidence, if any, do you need to produce? Always make sure that you keep to your mandatory reporting requirements. As I said, there is a 5-year criminal penalty there if you don't, but really to protect the children in your care, you need to make sure that you are reporting anything that you feel puts a child at significant risk of harm. Be aware of indicators and note down behaviours of concern. So as I said, it might not be as clear cut as taking off a child's shirt and seeing cigarette burns. It might be that they have a bruise one day and mum comes with a bruise the next day, and then 2 weeks later they have a broken arm, and 3 weeks later they have ongoing issues. So if you're just making notes in a some kind of jottings or running records or observation notes down of when these things occur over a period of time, you are then substantiating or getting information together to show why you are feeling that that child is at risk. Be aware of secondary support. So as I said, a lot of time abuse is not what a parent has set out to do, but is secondary and has occurred because of breakdown, whether it's financial pressures, whether it's family breakdown, whether it's alcohol and drug related. So being aware of what a family's going through and having a good relationship to them so you can support them and you can refer them to other services. In summary, we've gone over today that child protection is everyone's responsibility, that there are moral, ethical, legal obligations for us to protect children, that child abuse has a range of physical and behavioural indicators, and that each state has different reporting processes, but the fundamentals are the same. You are required to report suspected child abuse to the appropriate department. And as an educator, be aware of indicators and be ready to protect the children in your care. If there's any questions, I'll now answer them. So I can see a lot of questions coming through about certificates and how they'll be issued. And to note, the certificates will be emailed to everyone who participated today, and they will be sent via email. Great. If there's no other questions, I'll stop the session there. And thank you very much for attending today.